Hi there and welcome to this IBM Cloud Foundation Skills Series video, and in this particular video I'm going to give you an introduction to storage types. Okay, now there are three different types of storage that are available within the IBM Cloud. The first one is object storage, then we've got block storage, and finally we have file storage. So object storage is designed for storing unstructured data, and typically cloud applications tend to use object storage. It isn't directly attached to virtual servers, so to actually access object storage, you typically use an API. There's no actual sort of physical or logical connection to a virtual server. And object storage is really good for low-cost mass storage of items, but it's not really designed to store high I/O or structured data. So, for instance, you'd never put an operating system that you run a virtual machine from, and you would never put a database files onto object storage. It just would not work, and it just wouldn't be a suitable use. Now we're going to have now there already is a section up and running already on object storage, so I won't talk more about object storage in this particular section. But my colleague John Easton is actually putting together some great videos about object storage, which you can also find in this particular playlist and a part of the Foundation Skill Series. So file storage is network attached, it's NFS based, so it's a bit like if you think about NAS storage. The great thing about file storage is it can be easily shared between servers using NFS. The actual shares themselves can be created and be anything in size from 20 gigabytes will be the smallest size you can create a share. And that goes right up to 12 terabytes in size. That's for each individual share. So you can, so obviously that's an awful lot of disk space that you can create there. We have endurance and performance options. So these are based around IOPS, and if you're not familiar with IOPS, that's input-output operations per second. So this is effectively how fast the disk is. So we have endurance, which is slightly lower cost, but also slightly slower. And we also have performance options, which is it costs a little bit more, but the disk itself is actually far more performant and far speedier. So if you have performance considerations, you may want to look more closely at these two options. File storage allows snapshots, so you can snapshot your data really easily. You can replicate your data easily between different file storage options as well, and you can actually duplicate your file storage as well. So if, for instance, you want to just duplicate your disk to another place, you can do that really easily. And again, all those things really are there to support backup and recovery and disaster recovery and those sorts of things. And last thing really to say in this sort of very short section about file storage is that you can provision this stuff on an hourly or monthly billing cycle. So where would you use file storage? Well, it's great for, as the name implies, for file storage and also for sharing files. It's also pretty good for clustered databases. So if you have a database which perhaps doesn't have a high degree of IOPS, you don't need to have really performant disk underneath it, then it's actually quite a good solution for clustering databases. It's good for active archiving. So again, object storage is pretty good for archives. But if you have a number of machines which are looking to archive data, and those data archives are fairly active, then again, file storage might be a better option than object storage, because you can have the familiar file structures there, directory structures, etc., which you can't actually have so easily with object storage. They're also a great place to store big data files. So when I'm talking about big data files, I'm talking about files that you might want for ETL purposes. So if you've created a file that's ready to transform and load into a system, then file storage is actually quite a good place to put that, because again you can actively work on those files and draw them in. I've talked a little bit about endurance or performance. So when deciding between the two, you need to think about what your input output per second requirements are. So again, if you've got something where really the speed of the disk isn't so much of a concern, then endurance is typically a lower cost and a perfectly reasonable option. Whereas if you do need a bit more performance and assured IOPS, then you might want to look at performance offerings. And you can attach a file storage volume to up to 64 different connections. So that's actually so let's say 64 different virtual machines. You can actually create one single volume to. So that's actually a soft limit. If you need to do more than 64 connections, then you can contact support, and you can actually get that limit raised as well if you want to. So let's talk a little bit now about block storage. So block storage is iSCSI based, so it's a bit more like SAN storage for a virtual machine or a bare metal server. And rather than being network attached like file storage is, this is actually attached via multipath I/O connections. So again, if one particular connection fails, then because it's multipathed, then the machine can still actually access the storage. So it's actually highly available as well. You can create volumes from 20 gigabytes to 12 terabytes in size. So again, there's quite a big range there. And again, you have the endurance and performance options as you do with file storage. Again, for purposes of backup and recovery and disaster recovery, etc., it allows snapshots, replication, and duplication, and they're really easy to do. And again, there's hourly or monthly billing on block storage as well. So let's think about the use cases for block storage. So where the server actually requires persistent, reliable access to storage with consistent performance, you're actually better off using block storage over file storage, just because it's connected via those multipath I/O channels. It's good for high performance databases. So if you have your main production database, then you probably want to use block storage over file storage, just because of that additional performance. And the same really for e-commerce websites as well. If you've got a website that's got high amounts of traffic on it and it needs to perform well, then block storage is probably the best place to put it. So we've talked about I/O requirements already. So endurance, really you would use that for workloads where you don't really have a well-defined I/O requirement, or if the I/O requirements are generally quite low. You use performance, the performance option where the I/O requirements are actually quite well defined, and they obviously exceed the endurance levels. You can cluster with block storage as well, so you can actually cluster up to 8 hosts to give it access to a single volume. Okay, and that's it for this really short lecture. In the next lecture, we'll go into a bit more detail on file storage. Thanks for watching.